schedule, but thank you all so much for joining today. Now, this class is really something very unique and special because we are learning this week and we are reading the Torah portion of Parshas Vayechi. Parshas Vayechi is the last portion in the book of Bereshit. So we've concluded now, we will conclude this Shabbos, the first book of the Torah, the first book of the 5 books of Moses, right? Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. And it's like called a siyum. There's something very special when you conclude something in Torah learning. And what's really very unique, and we'll conclude the class with, is when we finish reading the Torah portion this week in Shul, everyone will proclaim and announce, Chazak, Chazak, v'nischazek. Let us all be strengthened and continue to strengthen one another and continue to study. And it's really very fascinating because in Torah and in Judaism, the more we learn, the more we want to learn, the more eager we are to continue learning. And learning never ends. Remember in camp, there was always this phrase that, it's learning class is now over, but learning never ends. We always continue whenever we can. So what's really very beautiful today is that, yes, it's like this conclusion, and growing up as a child, and my children still have it today, whenever in school we would finish a portion of the Torah, we always celebrated. There was a party, there was a celebration to really build up and to show the importance and the value of studying and then continuing our studies. And that's what's really very beautiful about today. And it's really special that we as a group have been studying together, have been learning, have been working on our Torah study. And it's really beautiful to be able to do this together and have our little siyum, our little conclusion as a group as we conclude this first book of the Torah and move on to the next book. So there's a lot of fascinating lessons in this portion. I'm going to try and capture a few of them. But what I also thought would be nice if anyone at any point during the class or at the end of the class perhaps would like to share an insight or a reflection on this book of Bereshit, starting with the creation of the world and the introduction of our forefathers and our matriarchs, our patriarchs, and then continuing into the birth of the 12 tribes, and here we are at the conclusion where the Jews end up in Egypt. And this portion is really like the foundation of who we are. It's our family history, right? And we know the importance of our heritage and who we are, and looking back and to see how we are standing on giants of shoulders, on giant shoulders. This is who we're standing on, and then we're able to continue and perpetuate everything that they represented. So that's what's so important about this week's portion. This week's portion is called Parshas Vayechi. Okay, now Parshas Vayechi, I'm going to get to it over here in this chumash that I have. Parshas Vayechi is introduced by this phrase. It goes as follows. It says, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana vayehi yimei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim va'arba'im u'ma'ah shana. Okay, and it says Yaakov lived in Egypt for 17 years. And the total of Yaakov's days, the years of his life, were 147 years. So the Parsha begins with Vayechi, and Yaakov lived. Where did he live for the last 17 years of his life? He lived in Egypt. Now this portion talks about his passing, but yet the name of the portion represents his life, and Yaakov lived. And we know, and we discussed this also by Sarah Imenu, by Sarah, our matriarch, and by many of our great Jewish leaders. And really, it has to do with even personal family members. It says that how does someone live on even after they pass into the world of truth? It says Mazaru b'chaim, Afu b'chaim. When their descendants and their offsprings follow in their ways, then they're still alive. If their children are alive, then they are alive. If their children continue and perpetuate and follow in the path that they were taught, and here specifically we're talking about, our forefather, Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov our father, who was the father of the Jewish nation. We are called by his name, the children of Israel. That was his name, Yisrael, right? His name Yaakov, the name Yisrael. We are his children. If we follow in his path, if we follow in all that he does, then he lives on. So there's a really beautiful insight and a beautiful story. And I watched a little clip yesterday of the Rebbe sharing this idea, and it was fascinating. So it says that this is a very famous passage that we study, right? That Yaakov 17 years were in Egypt. And what the Baal HaTurim, one of the great commentators, explained is that why does it tell us about these 17 years? Because he says that these were Yaakov's 17 best years of his life. His best years of his life were while he was in Egypt. And think about it, he was living in the land of Israel, called the land of Canaan at that time. And those should have been his best years. But here it says specifically the years in Egypt were his best years. And the Rebbe explains at a Farbrengen once, he talks about how the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Chabad Rebbe, as a young boy, here, 1 second. Okay, so the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the third Chabad Rebbe, the Rebbe shares this beautiful, beautiful insight and story about him. It says when he was a young child, studying Chumash and Cheder, okay, in Russia. Now, just to give a little bit of history, the Tzemach Tzedek, his mother passed away when he was a young child. And she, before her passing, her name was Devorah Leah. She was the daughter of the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, okay, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And before her passing, there's a whole really very deep and emotional and beautiful story about her and how she gave her life for Chassidus. But before her passing, she actually said to her father, I am asking you to raise my son. I'm leaving a young son behind. I'm asking you to raise him. And so the Tzemach Tzedek, whose name was Menachem Mendel, he was raised in the home of the Alter Rebbe, of the first Chabad Rebbe. So when he was a young child, it says he came home from Cheder, and he studied this in Cheder, that the best years of Yaakov's life were the 17 years in Egypt. And a young child, he comes to his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, and here the Rebbe describes something very beautiful. He says, think about this. The Alter Rebbe was the leader of tens of thousands of Chassidim, a packed schedule, the author of the Tanya, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, a very holy man, a righteous man. The Tzemach Tzedek, in truth, could have gone to his father, to his grandmother, to his aunts and uncles. The Alter Rebbe had a large family. He could have asked this question to his teacher. But no, he comes home from Cheder and he goes to his grandfather to ask him this question. And his grandfather, with his busy schedule and the life that he led and the leader of the Jewish people and so many Hasidim, doesn't tell him, go ask someone else this question. He takes the time and he says to Tzemach Tzedek, he answers him, he discusses it with him, he talks to him. And the Rebbe says here, we see the unique opportunity we have when people come to us with a question. When a child comes to us with a question, don't send them to someone else. Take the time and listen. Take the time to hear what they have to say and answer them. And to me, it really hit home. I mean, I'm still raising a young family and our children, but even our adult children, even our adult friends, when people come to us with a question, don't send them to someone else. If we can help them, fine. If not, we can be a listening ear. And the fact that the Rebbe takes the time at a Hasidic gathering, at a Farbrengen, to discuss and to talk about the value that the Alter Rebbe, the great Jewish leader, made sure to listen to this young child and made sure to give him the time and to answer him. And so the Tzemach Tzedek, young Menachem Mendel, the age 4 or 5, comes to his grandfather and he says, I don't understand. How could it be that Yaakov's best years were in Egypt? Egypt wasn't a good place. Egypt was full of impurity. Egypt represented the idea, right? What does Egypt represent? Constriction, refinement. And how could it be that those were Yaakov's best years? And so the Alter Rebbe says to him, you know why they were his best years? This is what he tells this young child. They were his best years because before he went down to Egypt, he sent Yehuda. He sent his son Yehuda, Reuven Shimon Levi Yehuda, his 4th child. He sent Yehuda ahead of him, as we discussed last week, to set up a yeshiva system, right? He sent him to set up a school. And that's why these were his best years. But let's think about that a moment. There were schools in Israel too. I'm sure they had schools in the land of Canaan. Why was it so unique that would then make it that these were his best and greatest years? There were yeshivas all over. But this is what the Alter Rebbe explains. And then the Rebbe goes on to explain something even deeper about this idea of why was it so unique that in Egypt in particular were these Yaakov's best years. The Rebbe goes on to explain an incredible insight. He says that there are different ways to understand and to elevate darkness and impurity in this world. Egypt represents impurity. The land of Israel represents purity, righteousness, spirituality. In Egypt, that Yaakov went down to, there were different ways to elevate things, the same way we can elevate darkness. So there's one way of looking at darkness, right? That it's the absence of light. Okay? You bring in some light, the darkness goes away, right? You light a candle, we say, a little bit of light dispels a lot of darkness. You light the candle and the darkness goes away. But then there's another way to take away darkness. And this is what's so fascinating. And this is a deeper level. Now, not only do you change the darkness and you bring in the light, right? You add in the light and suddenly it dispels it. But what you do over here is you actually transform the darkness into light. There's a complete transformation. The darkness doesn't exist anymore. It's only light. And one example that I can give with this is the idea of, a thief. Right? You can either take a thief who represents darkness and impurity and put them away, remove them, stick them in jail, send them somewhere else, far away, that they won't affect anyone anymore. They won't steal anymore. Or what do you do with this thief? You transform the thief, that they become one of you, and they join the police force. Suddenly this thief, you're not just sticking them away somewhere, you're not just taking away the darkness and the impurity, you're transforming this person whose entire life had negativity and was hurting other people. Suddenly that person became the good guy. You transform them. It's completely transforming the darkness. What happened when Yaakov went down to Egypt? Yaakov was on such a high spiritual level that there actually was no darkness in Egypt for him. It was completely spiritual. Everything in his life was spiritual. It says that in Egypt, his children, the tribes and the Jewish people, by all the good that they didn't only bring light into Egypt, they transformed Egypt into a holy place. They transformed the darkness, the impurity, into purity, into light, and into goodness and kindness. And that is why, at this point, Yaakov doesn't just say it was good. It says that these were his best years. And how do we see that? Because 17 is the gematria, it's the numerical value of Tov. So that's how the rabbis decipher that these 17 years were Tov, they were his best years that he lived, because he saw a complete transformation. There was a complete transformation from negativity to positivity and to purity. And that's what was done. And as Alter Rebbe explains to his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, right, who was the third Chabad Rebbe, that in Egypt, the fact that Yehuda went down to set up a school, to take a place that could have potentially been so negative, and they made it so positive. And of course, this has a tremendous lesson to our own lives and into everything that we do. We can see it, right, with the right, or we could see it with the left. We could see it in a positive way, or God forbid, unfortunately, there are people who see things in a negative way. Let's remember to see it as Tov. Just like Yaakov was able to take a situation where he was leaving the holiness of the land of Israel, going down, and Egypt is literally down. It's south of the land of Israel, going down into Egypt, and to transform that place and for his children for years to come. And of course, that gives us the strength today in every situation that we're in. It said that today we live in a spiritual darkness. It's bright outside today. I mean, the snow is out and it's as bright as day. And my kids noticed the other day while it started snowing. Hey, Zalman, do you want to say hi? And show everybody your rocket ship. You want to show everyone? No. And then you're going to go play. Zalman wants to show you a rocket ship that he and Seema made.
Oh,
So cool.
That's great.
And it is soaring high.
Wow,
that's really neat.
Bye, rocket ship. Please
Bye-bye, ship.
It's great, Salman.
And of course, that could be applied in our lives. If anyone would like to add or share something here, I would love to hear. But the Rebbe then goes on to say one more thing, that he says that what was unique in this situation is that, and many of us experience this in life, right? And we could say, so we say how in Egypt, they took this, the impurity and made it pure. And that is something that we have to view really in our own lives as well, that we're all on a journey. And we could say to ourselves, there've been so many years that I didn't have a chance to do mitzvot. There were so many years that I didn't study Torah. But let's not look at that as a negative. What we have to look at that and say is, once I began to study and once I began to learn, I am transforming all my years and making them positive. And then the Rebbe explains, so what about a person who was raised religious? right? And did study Torah all their lives. Do they not get that benefit of being able to transform something and see the beauty of everything that Yiddishkeit has to offer? He says, yes, even more so, because when a person who is raised religious continues in that path and then encourages other, that is their benefit. And that is where they are able to appreciate and experience this light. So these are just a couple really beautiful things. We're all on a journey, and the Jews in Egypt began their journey, right? The Jews came down to Egypt. Yaakov lived there, it says, for his 17 best years. And then we know about, it says that the Jews, they were in Egypt for 210 years, right? And they were enslaved for approximately about 116. And the worst of it was about 86, 87 years. Like from, a little bit later on. The actual slavery only began once all of the tribes passed away. And that's what we'll study next week. And then it says a new king arose. It says that Pharaoh forgot the tribes, he forgot Joseph, and that's when he enslaves the Jews. But right at this point, what we are still studying, the Jews were living in Goshen. They were living in an area that they were able to focus on their studies, focus on their families, focus on all the wonderful things that life has to bring them. And of course, these are so very important for all of us to recall and to really integrate into every single thing that we do. So just a really great lesson. And again, to remember the value and the importance of really continuing the legacy of those who have passed, our loved ones in whether it's friends, as we have discussed, remember Aggie's friend a few weeks ago, or our parents, our siblings, or anyone who has passed on to the world of truth. We have the ability to keep their memory alive. Mazaru b'chaim, afu b'chaim. Their descendants are alive, they are alive, and it works for everyone. And we learn that here from Yaakov. And Yaakov, being our father, right? He continues to give us that strength in all the situations that we are put into. The portion has a lot of insight. It goes on into the portion you talk about how Yaakov then asks his son Yosef, who was, right, the viceroy in Egypt. He says, I want you to promise me that you will not bury me in Egypt. The Egyptians will want me to be here, because it said that when Yaakov and his family came to Egypt, Egypt became even more prosperous, and they became the wealthiest nation, most powerful nation. And he said, the Egyptians will want me to stay in Egypt, and I don't want to be buried here. I want to be buried back in Israel, in the cave of the patriarchs, in the Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron. And it's interesting, he says that the reason Yaakov made sure that Yosef would promise him this is because he knew that it could be that Yosef, deep in his heart, always wondered why his mother wasn't buried in the cave of the patriarchs, right? And she was buried on the side of the road in Beit Lechem. And this is the opportunity for Yaakov to explain to Yosef why his mother was buried there, that it was actually her choice. Remember, we had discussed this by her yahrzeit, that she chose to be buried there so that when her children would go into exile, and the Babylonians would exile us, and the Romans would exile us, the Jews wouldn't have time to go to Hebron as they were leaving Jerusalem, but they would pass right by Rachel's tomb in Beit Lechem. And so he wants to clarify that and sort of have closure, right? Always important to have closure with his son Yosef. And that's why he says, please promise me that you will bury me, even though you might think that I just abandoned your mother. I didn't. She was the ultimate Yiddish mama who wanted to be there for her children. And of course, Yosef promises his father that he will take him back to the land of Israel and bury him there after his passing. It did take some time. It says that he first remained in Egypt for, I think it was about 30 days. And then the tribes went and buried him in Israel and then came back into Egypt. Now, in this portion, we find that Yaakov blesses each of his sons. And we're not going to go through each and every one, but I would encourage you over Shabbos, if you have a chumash, or if you can print out some articles, to read through the blessings that he gives to each of his children. He finds within each of them their qualities and what they will give, to society and to the Jewish people. And he mentions it to them. But he asks Yosef, he does mention to Yosef that he wants to bless Yosef's two sons. Yosef had two sons by the names of Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh was the older one, Ephraim was the younger one. And this is the famous story in Jewish history, right? It says that when Yosef brings his two boys into Yaakov, right? So he puts Manasseh in front of Yaakov's right arm, and he puts Ephraim in front of Yaakov's left hand, and that his father would bless them. But actually what happens is Yaakov crosses, right, his arms, and he puts his right hand on Ephraim, his left hand on Manasseh, because through prophecy, he saw that from Manasseh would come some people who would not be so great for the Jewish people. And that is why he puts his right hand on Ephraim, on the younger son. But what's fascinating is, and we also have this in this week's portion, is that when we bless our children, so as Jewish people, we have a custom. Some people have a custom to bless their children every Friday night. Some people bless their children at special occasions, and in particular before Yom Kippur. When we bless our sons, we bless them to be Ephraim u'Menashe. Isn't that fascinating? We don't bless them to be like Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Our daughters, we say, should be blessed like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. That's how we bless our daughters. When we bless our sons, we say, Gesimcha Elohim, God should give upon you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And we're going to see right now why. Ephraim and Manasseh represented something that had not been represented yet within the Jewish people. They were raised in exile. The rest of the tribes, their children were born in the land of Israel. Holiness. It's of course, there's always challenges in raising children, but when you're raising your children in spirituality, when everyone is studying Torah and everyone is living that lifestyle, hooray. What happens when you have to raise your children out in the fields, out in the jungle, let's say, right? Out in the places where their friends are not doing what they're doing and their schooling is not what you would like it to be. They are being raised in exile. We have to put in an extra effort. We have to make sure that they are raised according to Torah mitzvahs. Manasseh and Ephraim were raised in Egypt. That's where they were born. They were born as Jewish children, raised in Egypt. And Yaakov was showing generations of Jewish people that we can raise children in exile to be righteous, just like Ephraim and Manasseh. And not just only righteous in their study, but in their actions and in their deeds and how they dealt with other people. And this is this really profound and incredible lesson. So let's learn a little bit about the names Ephraim and Manasseh and why did Yaakov give them those names, okay? So let's see now, what do the names Ephraim and Manasseh each represent, okay? We'll begin with Ephraim. It says that, actually we'll begin with Manasseh. It says when Manasseh was born, Manasseh was the older, Yosef named him the name Manasseh. He said, Ki Neshani Elokim. Remember, Yosef was sold as a slave, right? He was 17 years old. He was a young boy. And when his son was born, there was a lot of comfort in it. But what does he say? Ki Neshani Elokim, that God caused me to forget the pain of leaving my father's home, that it shouldn't be so difficult for him anymore. And then what does he name Ephraim, his second son? Ki Hifrani Elokim, that God made me fruitful, God made me successful, right? He was the viceroy in Egypt. He was second in command. He physically, and in a very physical way, God made him very, very successful. Yes, he kept his Yiddishkeit strong, but he became this huge macher in Egypt. I mean, second in command to Pharaoh. Everyone had to listen to Yosef. This is it. Yosef's word was everything. Ki Hifrani Elokim, God made me successful. And these two names, Ephraim and Manasseh, represent how we live in exile, right? On the one hand, when we live in exile, we have this yearning that we want to return to our Father's home. What's our Father's home? Redemption, the Holy Temple, right? We're missing the Beis HaMikdash, which is the house of God, where we all want to be in Yerushalayim. And while we're in exile, we miss it terribly. Even though none of us were present when there was a Holy Temple, but as Jewish people, we are raised with a desire and the love to have it rebuilt because we are missing it. We're all missing being in that complete spirituality. Yes, we can do our best here in exile, and that's what Manasseh represents. Manasseh represents that, yes, even though we miss it terribly, and we miss being in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem with the Holy Temple, while we are in exile, Manasseh, while we are still in exile, what Ephraim represents is we have to make sure that we are being successful in the way that God wants us to be. So of course we long and we desire for the better and greater days of redemption. But while we are in exile, we have to recognize where we are and be successful in the ways that God wants us to be. And that is what Ephraim and Manasseh represent. That in exile, of course, we miss the good old days. We miss them terribly. But God gives us comfort and allows us to be successful here in exile with the intent and with the constant yearning of being reunited back in Jerusalem. And that's what happened with Yosef. Yosef raised these two boys in Egypt. Of course, he was longing for his father's home, and God gave him comfort where he was. And what was that comfort? That he was successful. But not only was he successful physically in wealth, he was successful in raising a religious family in exile. And that is and being that we are still in exile, I mean, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt, but unfortunately we are now in our third and final exile. And it says that this redemption will be the final redemption. There will be no more exiles after our holy temple, the third temple will be rebuilt. But we have a mission while we are still in exile. And we yearn to leave it immediately. But while we are here, God gives us a mission. While we are here, we have the mission to elevate and to bring in spirituality, just like the Jews did in Egypt. Just like it says that Yaakov, those were his 17, those years were told, those years were his best years because he saw that happening. He saw, I guess it gave him pride that he realized that his children, and he knew that we would suffer. He knew that we would be put into exile multiple times, but he also saw that we would succeed. And I guess maybe that's what gave him comfort. And that's what made those years also so successful and so good for him, because he saw his children thriving even when it wasn't easy. These are hopefully some lessons and some inspiration, right? And some guidance that we can take from everything that the Jews experienced there. And we'll learn further in the book of Shemot, we learn about the journey and the struggle of the Jews in Egypt. But what's interesting is, and we'll conclude with this, is this week's portion ends with a very interesting line. It ends, the last line of the book of Bereshis. I mean, think about who we are as Jewish people ends. And Yosef passes away in the land of Egypt at 110 years, and his body is in Egypt. Think about that. The book of Bereshis, which begins with creation of the world and monumental ideas and thoughts and, transforming the world, ends, and Yosef's body is in Egypt. And the Rebbe gives incredible insight. Why does the portion end that Yosef is in Egypt with us? Because what happens after this? We begin exile, and we begin a very intense, difficult exile for the Jewish people. What is God showing us? What is God teaching us? That God never leaves us alone. Yosef remained in Egypt with the Jewish people. His body remained in Egypt. They actually had sunk to the bottom of the sea. And when the Jews left Egypt over 100 years later, they actually arose and they took his body with them to the land of Israel, along with all the other tribes. All the tribes actually were sort of buried in Egypt, remained with the Jews throughout exile. And when the Jews were redeemed, their bodies were moved into the land of Israel. But this is teaching us that God never forsakes his children. He has always given us Jewish leaders. He has always given us mentors, people who can guide us through difficult times. And we see this from here. It says that Yosef's remains are in Egypt. Yosef was still with the Jewish people. His leadership was still there. He was guiding them every step of the way. And that's what gave them strength to endure the difficulties of exile. And it's no different today, my friends. In every generation, God gives us great Jewish leaders who can guide us and who can help us and who can encourage us. And many times, even after their passing, if they are a true Jewish leader, their impact and their influence is still there. And I can say this personally, and I'm sure everyone here who's been touched by the Rebbe and the Rebbe's guidance, and many of us here, many of you never met the Rebbe personally, right? Because you only became involved years later. But the impact is there. The leadership is there by studying his teachings, by watching today with technology. I mean, we can see the teachings of the Rebbe and the encouragement that he had for and continues to have for each and every person. But being that we are human beings, we ask Hashem to end this exile so that we can be reunited with our great leaders with the coming of Mashiach immediately. So I found this portion to give a lot of, it was very encouraging, right? There's a lot of encouraging messages here of how to live our lives and how to be able to get through times, even when they may seem really difficult, to remember that God is always with us. God is always encouraging us and always giving us a high five, like you're doing great, just keep doing it. And, you know, it's wonderful in life when you get those little reminders. And many times throughout life, we get those reminders. You know, we do something and we're not sure if it's exactly what we had in mind. And then, you know, you see the fruits of your labor. And we should all be able to see it in a happy, good way. So with that, we conclude the portion of Vayechi, and we conclude the book of Bereshis. And together we can say, Chazak, Chazak, Chazak. Let us be strengthened. Let us continue to study. Let's continue to learn and grow. And how wonderful to do it together.
Amen.
So if anyone I would love to hear if anyone has any insight or something that they'd like to share about this portion or anything that we studied in the previous portions, please unmute yourself and let's hear.
I have something to say. I think the most interesting part of this Parsha has to do with the burials of the matriarchs and patriarchs. Well, that not all of them are buried in Israel. That there are some very significant reasons for them not being buried in Israel. But yet, when the end of days comes, or when the Mashiach comes, everybody will be in Israel. I'm not quite sure I understand how that will all happen. And maybe it's not for us to understand at this point.
It's a great point, Sue. So really interesting. So first of all, let's just clarify. The matriarchs and patriarchs are all buried in Israel. Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah are all. The 12 tribes, the 12 tribes, during the years when the Jews were in Egypt, they remained in Egypt. Their remains were in Egypt. But when the Jews actually left Egypt, like it was their redemption, they did take, the 12 tribes then were buried in the land of Israel. But I think your point is absolutely fascinating and so true, because today we have many great righteous leaders, Jewish leaders, who are not buried in Israel, right? We have many great righteous leaders buried all throughout Europe and all throughout Russia and even here in America, correct? And they're not. Right. And if you think about it, many of them could have chosen and said, take me to Israel, bury me in Israel. But why do you think they remained in their respective places? I believe truly so that we should have a place to go and pray. You know, when the Jews were living in Soviet Russia, right? I mean, think about even Mordechai and Esther are buried in Persia. I once saw a picture of their tomb. Rivka Rachnia told me she actually had gone to visit when she was younger. You know, many of our greats chose to be buried where they lived and where they led the Jewish people. And it's so that we can be there. Like we said, in Russia, right, when the Soviets didn't allow Jews to leave or anything, at least secretly they could go and pray at the graves of tzaddikim who were buried throughout Russia, or buried throughout Europe. And today we have here in America, we have, you know, many people, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people flock to the Ohel of the Rebbe every single year to go and to pray, because as Jewish people, we have always been raised and encouraged to study to pray at the graves of tzaddikim. And actually, where do we learn that from? We learn it from the story of the spies. The story of the spies, it says that when Moshe Rabbeinu sent the 12 spies to Israel, 2 of the spies, Kalev and Yehoshua, who came back with a positive report, recognized they would need strength for this trip. It wasn't going to be so simple. And it says that the moment they got into Israel as the spies, they went to Hebron. They went to pray at the cave of our patriarchs for strength. So as Jewish people, we believe strongly in praying at the graves of tzaddikim, of righteous people who can then intercede on our behalf. So Sue, your point is really very important. So yes, in today's day and age, when there are many Jewish people not buried in Israel, with the coming of Mashiach, there will be something called Trias HaMesim, right? That all of the dead will become alive. I guess the details will unfold when Mashiach comes. We'll get more details then. It's a little hard to, wrap our heads around it, but it will happen. It's a prophecy that has been given to the Jewish people from the beginning of time. And, we've seen little glimmers of it but there's no question that, it says that the righteous first, and then all Jewish people will end up in Israel. Some do say that the whole world will become Israel. Israel's a state of holiness. So we'll see. Let's just let it happen so we can all experience and see for ourselves. But thank you for bringing up that point. It is a very important one. I hope that helped with your question a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to share?
I just had a question, Dini. Why in the Chumash is Yaakov sometimes called Yaakov and sometimes Israel? I know he received that name later, but why does it keep like flip-flopping or whatever?
That's actually a very good question. So there's many great Jewish leaders who've had like different names, even like Esther, Queen Esther, by the way. Her birth name was Hadassah. And when she went to the palace, she was called Esther because he said to hide her identity. So my understanding is that for Yaakov, sometimes Yaakov and sometimes Yisrael, it had to do with different periods and different times. Most of the time, he is actually called Yaakov. He's given the name Yisrael by Esav's angel. We are then called Yisrael because Yisrael has that name of compassion and who he was as our father. So my understanding is that throughout the Torah, most of the times he is referred to as Yaakov. And then we are then called the children of Israel. That was the name that was chosen for us. Okay, and I mean, yeah, that's.
Thank you.
And there might be a better answer, but we can look into it. All right, I mean, Yisrael has the name of God in it. So, I mean, we are the children of, the chosen children of Hashem. All right, anyone else have anything they'd like to share or add before we conclude? All right, well, it's really, really wonderful. Always great to learn together and to gain from each other. So I'm going to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos. I know it's Thursday, but we prepare and we think about Shabbos all week, so it's good. Okay, have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Have a good Shabbos, and we will meet again next week.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for
Not
teaching.
sooner. Okay.
Bye.